The morning sun had just broken through the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the quiet roadside diner. Steam rose from coffee cups as the early risers hunched over plates of eggs and bacon. The roadside diner stood as it had for decades, a weathered sentinel along the forgotten stretch of highway that cut through the heartland of America like an old scar. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint scent of motor oil that clung to the men seated at the corner booth. They were impossible to miss, these men, wearing leather vests emblazoned with the Iron Wolves MC patch. Their weathered faces told stories no one dared to ask about their calloused hands wrapped around coffee mugs bearing the faded logo of the diner. Mason Cole sat with his back to the wall, blue eyes scanning the room from beneath the brim of his worn baseball cap. At 38, his face carried the marks of a man who had seen too much of the world's darker corners. The Iron Wolves patch on his leather vest sat above the emblem of the United States Marine Corps, faded but still proud, on his chest. The other patches told stories of rides across state lines, rallies attended, and brothers remembered. Past the hot sauce, Doc, Mason said, his voice carrying that particular gravel that comes from years of shouting over the thunder of Harley engines and the cacophony of war. Doc, whose real name few remembered anymore, slid the bottle across the worn Formica table. At 50, his salt and pepper beard and steady hands spoke of his former life as a combat medic. Beside him sat Bear, aptly named for his massive frame and the grizzled beard that covered most of his face. The 45-year-old former Special Forces operator still carried himself with military precision despite the long hair and tattoo-covered arms. The quiet morning rhythm continued unbroken. Silverware clinked against plates. Coffee cups were refilled by Maggie, the waitress, who had been serving the same regulars for nearly 20 years and knew exactly how they took their coffee without having to ask. The rumble of conversation and country music from the ancient jukebox filled the air until the moment when everything changed. The door to the diner burst open with such force that the bell above nearly tore from its mooring. The loud crack silenced every voice in the room. Standing in the doorway, small and trembling, was a little girl no more than 7 years old. Her light brown hair flew wild around her dirt-smudged face. The red dress she wore was torn at the hem, and her small chest heaved with panicked breaths. But it was her eyes that captured everyone's attention, wide with terror, brimming with tears that carved clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Please!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Her small arms stretched out, finger pointing back toward the road. "They're hurting my mama. Please, somebody help her." The diner fell into stunned silence. A waitress dropped a plate. The cook peered out from the kitchen window. 2 truck drivers by the counter turned their heads, but no one moved. No one except Mason Cole. Mason rose from his seat in one fluid motion, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He crossed the diner in long strides, his boots heavy against the floor, and knelt before the little girl. He didn't tower over her or speak down to her. Instead, he lowered himself to meet her eyes. "Where's your mama, sweetheart?" His voice, usually gruff from years of shouting orders and riding into the wind, softened to a gentle rumble. The little girl's lower lip quivered. Her small fingers clutched at the torn fabric of her dress. "In our trailer," she sobbed. "Down the road, the blue one with white shutters." She pointed frantically toward the east. "He's hurting her real bad. Please help her." Mason's eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, softened with understanding. He had seen this before in war zones abroad and broken homes at home. The face of fear wore the same expression regardless of the country or context. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steady and calm, an anchor in her storm. "Hannah," she whispered, her small voice shaking. "My mama's name is Carla." Mason nodded once. "Hannah, my name is Mason. Those are my friends, Bear and Doc." He gestured toward the booth where the other men were already standing, faces set with grim determination. "We're going to help your mama, right now." As Mason stood, memories flickered through his mind like old photographs. The daughter he had lost 5 years ago would have been about Hannah's age now. Emma had the same light in her eyes that Hannah's fear couldn't completely extinguish. The thought cut through him like a cold blade between the ribs, but he pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time. Turning to Maggie, the waitress, Mason spoke with quiet authority. "Take care of her. We'll be back soon." Maggie nodded, already moving toward Hannah with a blanket kept behind the counter for cold mornings. She wrapped it around the little girl's trembling shoulders and guided her to a seat, speaking words of comfort too soft for Mason to hear. Bear and Doc were already standing by the door, their breakfast forgotten. No words needed to be exchanged between the three men who had served together, ridden together, mourned together. They moved as a unit, pushing through the diner door and into the parking lot where three Harley-Davidson motorcycles sat waiting, chrome gleaming in the morning sunlight. Mason swung his leg over his black, soft-tailed machine, it as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The custom-built 1990 model roared to life beneath him, the sound of the V-twin engine echoing across the nearly empty parking lot. Bear and Doc mounted their own bikes, the thunder of three engines blending into a growl that seemed to shake the very air. As they pulled onto the highway, Mason in the lead, he felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through multiple tours in Iraq. His eyes scanned the roadside ahead, quickly spotting the small cluster of trailers nestled among a stand of pine trees about a quarter-mile down the road. The blue trailer with white shutters stood slightly apart from the others at the end of a gravel drive. Even from a distance, Mason could see the door hanging askew on its hinges. He twisted the throttle, urging more speed from his machine as the sound of breaking glass reached his ears. The three motorcycles skidded to a halt in front of the trailer, throwing up clouds of dust. Mason was off his bike before it had fully stopped moving toward the damaged door with the efficient, measured pace of a man accustomed to entering hostile situations. Bear flanked him on the left while Doc hung back, slightly ready to provide aid if needed. Through the broken window, Mason could hear a man's voice slurred with alcohol and rage. "You thought you could hide from me. You think you're smarter than me, Carla. I told you what would happen if you ever ran." A woman's voice responded, high and frightened but defiant. "Get out, Derek. The police are already on their way." The sound of something heavy hitting a wall was followed by a sharp cry of pain. Mason didn't hesitate. He hit the door with his shoulder, the already damaged hinges giving way completely. The door crashed inward, revealing the cramped interior of the trailer. The scene inside burned into Mason's memory with photographic clarity. A woman with copper hair was backed against the kitchen counter, her face already swelling on one side, a trickle of blood running from her split lip. Her eyes were wide with fear but blazed with a mother's determination to survive for her child. Looming over her was a man in his mid-30s, muscular but soft around the middle, in the way that spoke of too much beer and too little discipline. He wore jeans and a stained white tank top, and his right hand was raised to strike again. In his left hand, a half-empty bottle of whiskey caught the morning light streaming through the window. Derek spun around at the sound of the door crashing in his bloodshot eyes, widening at the sight of three leather-clad bikers filling the doorway. For a moment, the tableau held Derek frozen in surprise, Carla pressing herself against the counter, Mason and his brothers standing like avenging angels in the doorway. Then Mason moved. Years of military training took over. He crossed the distance in two long strides, his hands shooting out to capture Derek's raised wrist in a grip like iron. With a practiced twist, he bent the arm at an unnatural angle, forcing Derek to his knees with a howl of pain. The whiskey bottle fell from his other hand, shattering on the linoleum floor in a spray of glass and amber liquid. "Who the hell are you?" Derek snarled through gritted teeth, trying to maintain some semblance of defiance despite his compromised position. Mason didn't waste words. He applied more pressure to the wrist lock, driving Derek fully to the ground. "The lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Bear moved in his massive hands, easily restraining Derek's other arm, while Mason maintained the painful hold. Doc stepped past them, moving toward Carla with his hands held palms forward in a non-threatening gesture. "Ma'am, I'm a medic. That cut needs attention," he said, his voice gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "May I?" Carla nodded shakily, her eyes darting between Doc and the subdued Derek on the floor. "My daughter," she said urgently. "Hannah, is she safe?" "She's the one who brought us here," Mason replied, his eyes never leaving Derek. "She's at the diner with Maggie. She's safe." Relief washed over Carla's face, followed immediately by a surge of maternal pride. "She ran all the way to the diner, my brave girl." As Doc began tending to Carla's injuries with supplies from the small kit he always carried, Mason and Bear conducted a quick search of Derek. The discovery of a small bag of white powder in his pocket and a switchblade in his boot only hardened Mason's expression. "Dealing again, Derek?" Mason asked, having caught the recognition that flashed across Carla's face when they found the drugs. Derek spat onto the floor. You don't know who you're messing with, old man. Mason increased the pressure on the hold just enough to make Derek gasp. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A coward who beats women and deals poison on the side. In the distance, the wail of police sirens grew steadily louder. Someone had called the authorities, perhaps one of the neighbors in the nearby trailers. Mason exchanged a glance with Bear, a silent communication born of years of friendship. They would stay and face the music. Running wasn't their way, not anymore. Doc finished placing a butterfly bandage on Carla's cheekbone and stepped back. Nothing's broken, but you'll have some nasty bruising. The cut won't need stitches. Thank you, Carla whispered, her eyes welling with tears now that the immediate danger had passed. She was a pretty woman beneath the bruises, with intelligent green eyes and a quiet dignity that even her circumstances couldn't diminish. I don't know how to thank you all. When he found us, I thought, you don't need to thank us. Mason said, his attention still focused on keeping Derek subdued. Your little girl did the right thing. She's the brave one here. The police cruiser pulled up outside, lights flashing. Two officers approached cautiously, hands near their weapons, as they took in the scene of three bikers and a restrained man inside the damaged trailer. Police, everyone freeze, called the first officer through the doorway. In here, officer, Mason called back calmly. We're detaining an assailant who was attacking this woman. We're unarmed and compliant. The officers entered, hands still hovering near their holstered weapons. The lead officer, whose nameplate identified him as Reynolds, surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. His gaze lingered on the Iron Wolves patches before moving to Carla's injured face, then to Derek on the floor. What's going on here, ma'am? He asked Carla directly, his tone professional, but not unkind. Carla straightened her shoulders. This is Derek Wilson, my ex-boyfriend. He just got out of jail yesterday and somehow found where my daughter and I have been living. He broke in this morning and attacked me. She gestured to her face. These men heard my daughter asking for help at the diner down the road and came to my rescue. Officer Reynolds nodded, then turned his attention to Mason and Bear. You can release him now. We'll take it from here. Mason and Bear carefully transferred Derek to the officers, who efficiently handcuffed him and read him his rights. Derek continued to mutter threats under his breath as they led him outside to the waiting cruiser. The younger officer stayed behind to take statements and document Carla's injuries with a small digital camera. As Mason gave his account of events, he noticed Carla watching him with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He understood her caution. Men like them, rough-looking bikers with hard faces and calloused hands, weren't usually cast as heroes in stories like these. They were more often viewed with suspicion, avoided on streets, watched carefully in stores. But today, for once, their intimidating appearance had served a purpose beyond keeping the world at arm's length. The officers were thorough in their questioning. Yes, Mason and his friends had entered without permission. Yes, they had used physical force to subdue Derek. Yes, they were aware that vigilante justice was not encouraged by law enforcement. But given the circumstances and Carla's corroboration of their account, the officers seemed satisfied that they had acted appropriately. We'll need you all to come by the station later to sign formal statements, Officer Reynolds said as they prepared to leave. He handed Mason a card with the address of the police station. And ma'am, you should consider filing for an emergency protection order. Carla nodded, though Mason noted the flicker of doubt in her eyes. He had seen it before, that look that said paper protections meant little against determined violence. As the officers led Derek away, the second cruiser pulled up. The door opened and a small figure burst out, running toward the trailer with red sneakers flying. Mama, Hannah cried, her face alight with relief. Carla dropped to her knees, arms outstretched to receive her daughter in a fierce embrace. Hannah, my brave, brave girl. Mason, Bear, and Doc stepped outside to give mother and daughter privacy for their reunion. They stood by their motorcycles, lighting cigarettes and squinting against the brightening morning sun. What do you think? Bear asked quietly, nodding toward the trailer where Carla was now stroking Hannah's hair, whispering reassurances. Mason took a long drag from his cigarette, considering. He knew what Bear was really asking. What now? They had intervened, stopped the immediate threat, but what about tomorrow or the day after? Men like Derek didn't give up easily, especially when their pride had been wounded. She can't stay here, Mason said finally. Not with that door busted and him knowing where to find her. Doc nodded in agreement. That protection order won't do much good if he decides to come back before it's served. The three men fell silent, each contemplating the reality of the situation. They had done their good deed for the day, stepped in where others hadn't. By most standards, their obligation was fulfilled. But Mason couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, merely the opening chapter. The sound of small footsteps on gravel drew their attention. Hannah stood before them, her red dress still torn, but her face now clean of tears and dirt. In her small hand, she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit missing one ear. "Thank you for saving my mama," she said, her voice small but steady. Her eyes, the same vivid green as her mother's, looked directly at Mason with a child's unnerving perceptiveness. "Are you soldiers?" "My daddy was a soldier before he died." Mason felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of an old tight knot. He crouched down to her level the way he had at the diner. "We were soldiers once," he answered honestly. "Now we're just men trying to do the right thing when we see it needs doing." Hannah nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mama says we can't stay here anymore because Derek found us, but we don't have anywhere else to go right now." She glanced back at the trailer where Carla was speaking with Officer Reynolds. "I'm scared he'll come back." The simple honesty of a child often cut deeper than any adult confession. Mason looked at Baron Doc, reading the same resolution in their eyes that he felt forming in his own heart. Some decisions weren't made with careful deliberation. They were made in an instant of clarity that revealed what kind of man you truly were. "Hannah," Mason said gently, "would you and your mama feel safer if you stayed somewhere else for a while? Somewhere Derek wouldn't think to look?" Hannah's eyes widened. "Like where? The Iron Wolves have a clubhouse with an apartment upstairs. It's above our garage where we fix motorcycles. It's not fancy, but it's clean and safe." Hannah considered this with the serious expression of a child weighing an important decision. "Do you have tools there, real ones?" The unexpected question brought a small smile to Mason's weathered face. "More tools than you could count, kid." This seemed to satisfy her. She nodded decisively. "I'll tell Mama." She turned to go, then paused and looked back. "What's your name again?" "Mason, Mason Cole." "Thank you, Mr. Mason." With that, she ran back to her mother red dress fluttering behind her like a flag. Carla looked up as Hannah tugged at her hand, whispering urgently. Her eyes met Mason's across the yard, questioning and uncertain. He gave her a small nod, trying to convey without words that the offer was genuine, no strings attached. After a moment's hesitation, Carla approached the three bikers, Hannah's hand clasped firmly in hers. Up close, the bruising on her face looked worse in the full morning light, a blue-purple shadow spreading across her cheekbone. "Hannah says you offered us a place to stay," she said directly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Why would you do that?" It was a fair question. In a world where kindness often came with hidden price tags, suspicion was a necessary survival skill. "Because you need somewhere safe, and we have somewhere safe to offer," Mason replied simply. "Our clubhouse has a small apartment above the garage. It's nothing special, but it's secure. You and Hannah can stay there until you figure out your next move." Carla studied him intently, searching for hidden motives in his ice-blue eyes. Whatever she saw, there must have reassured her because some of the tension left her shoulders. "I don't have much money," she admitted. "I work at the local grocery store. It doesn't pay much, but—" "We're not asking for money," Bear interrupted gently. "Iron Wolves take care of their own, and we take care of people who need it. No charge." Carla's eyes welled with fresh tears, but she blinked them back resolutely. "I can cook and clean. I was a nurse before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing all the circumstances that had led her here. "I can help around your clubhouse, tend to injuries. I'm not looking for charity." Doc smiled, the expression softening his grizzled face. "We could use someone with medical training around. These two are constantly getting banged up with their foolish stunts." The lighthearted comment broke some of the tension, drawing a small smile from Carla. She looked down at Hannah, who was watching the exchange with solemn eyes, then back to Mason. "If you're sure, then, yes, we accept. Just until I can figure something else out." Mason nodded. "Let's get your essential things packed up. You can come back for the rest later, with a police escort if needed." The next half hour passed in a flurry of activity as Carla and Hannah gathered closed documents and a few precious mementos. Mason noticed the careful way Carla packed a small wooden box containing old photographs and the tenderness with which Hannah wrapped her few toys in a tattered blanket. These were the markers of a life lived in constant motion, knowing what to grab when you needed to run. By the time they had loaded the essential belongings onto Bear's motorcycle, securing them with bungee cords, the morning had fully blossomed into day. The sun hung high and bright in a cloudless sky, casting sharp shadows across the gravel drive. "I'll ride with Carla and Hannah in the police car," Doc volunteered. "Officer Reynolds offered to drop us at the clubhouse. You two can ride ahead and get things ready." Mason nodded in agreement. As he and Bear mounted their motorcycles, he caught sight of Hannah watching him with undisguised fascination. He remembered Emma at that age begging for rides on his Harley around the driveway, her mother pretending outrage while secretly taking pictures. The memory, usually painful, felt different today. Bittersweet rather than simply bitter. The ride back to Iron Wolf's territory gave Mason time to think. The clubhouse sat on the outskirts of town, a converted warehouse with the garage taking up the ground floor and the club's gathering space and apartment on the second. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and well-maintained, a point of pride for men who had known the disorder of war and valued the peace of a well-kept home. Bear pulled alongside Mason at a red light. "You okay with this?" he asked, raising his voice to be heard over the engines. "Taking them in." Mason considered the question. Was he okay with what? This wasn't their usual way. The Iron Wolves kept to themselves, helped their own, stayed out of other people's business, except for the occasional charity ride or community event. But something about Hannah's bravery and Carla's quiet dignity had resonated with him in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. "Yeah," he answered finally. "I'm okay with that." The light changed and they accelerated in unison, the roar of their engines drowning out any further conversation. But as they rode through the familiar streets toward the clubhouse, Mason found himself scanning doorways and windows with increased vigilance, as if threats might be lurking where none had existed before. The Iron Wolves clubhouse came into view, a sturdy brick building with large garage doors facing the street. The club's emblem, a wolf's head in profile howling, was painted on the wall beside the main entrance. Several motorcycles were already parked outside, belonging to members who had arrived for the day's work, or simply to spend time among brothers. Mason and Bear pulled into the parking area and cut their engines. Before they could even dismount, the clubhouse door opened and several members emerged, curious about their early return from breakfast. "What happened?" asked Riggs, the club president, a tall man in his 50s with a silver beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on the road. "You three left breakfast in a hurry." Mason explained the situation in brief, efficient sentences. As he spoke, he noticed the members' expressions changing from curiosity to grim understanding, then to resolute determination. The Iron Wolves might have rough exteriors, but they shared a core value system forged in military service and refined by years of brotherhood on the road. "So they're coming here," Riggs confirmed, glancing at the road, as if expecting the police car to appear at any moment. "To stay in the apartment." "Unless you have an objection," Mason replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't really asking permission so much as informing his president of a decision already made. Riggs considered for only a moment before nodding. "No objection. We've got the space and it sounds like they need it." He turned to the others. "Let's make sure the apartment is ready. Vic, you were using it last month when your pipes burst. Is it clean?" Victor, a younger member in his 30s, nodded. "Yeah, I cleaned up before I moved back home. Sheets are fresh, but it could use a woman's touch, you know." "Do what you can in the next 10 minutes, Riggs instructed. "They'll be here soon." The members dispersed, some heading upstairs to prepare the apartment, others returning to their work in the garage. Mason took the opportunity to check his phone for the first time since leaving the diner. A message from Doc confirmed they were about 5 minutes away. Bear returned from inside the clubhouse carrying 2 helmets. "Found these in the storage room," he said. "Thought the kid might like to have a proper ride sometime." One was a full-sized helmet in matte black. The other was smaller, clearly meant for a child, with a pattern of stars on a blue background. Mason took the smaller helmet, turning it over in his hands. "This Emma's old one?" Bear nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Figured it might fit Hannah. No sense letting it gather dust." Mason ran his thumb over one of the stars, remembering how excited Emma had been when he brought it home, how she had insisted on wearing it around the house for days. "Yeah," he said finally. "Good thinking." The sound of an approaching car drew their attention. The police cruiser pulled up in front of the clubhouse, Officer Reynolds at the wheel. Doc emerged from the passenger side, then helped Hannah from the back seat. Carla followed, clutching a small duffel bag, her eyes wide, as she took in the clubhouse with its wolf emblem and the row of motorcycles. Officer Reynolds rolled down his window. "I'll need all of you to come by the station this afternoon to give formal statements," he reminded them. "Around 2 o'clock work for everyone." Mason nodded in agreement. "We'll be there." The officer gave a brief nod before driving away, leaving Carla and Hannah standing uncertainly before the clubhouse. Other Iron Wolves members had emerged, forming a loose semicircle of leather vests and curious expressions. "Everyone, this is Carla and Hannah," Mason introduced. "They'll be staying with us for a while." He began pointing out individual members. "That's Riggs, our president, Victor, our youngest brother, Tank Whiskey and Preacher. You already know Bear and Doc." Hannah stared at the assembled men with wide-eyed fascination, particularly at Tank, whose massive frame and intricate tattoos made him an imposing figure. "Are you all soldiers too?" she asked boldly. Tank knelt down to her level, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "We were little lady, Army, Marines, Navy, different branches, same Brotherhood." Hannah nodded seriously, processing this information. "My daddy was in the Army. He died when I was really little." She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. "Mama says he was a hero." A moment of respectful silence followed her words. These men understood loss and sacrifice all too well. "Let's get you settled in," Riggs finally said, gesturing toward the side entrance that led to the stairs. "Victor made sure the apartment is ready." As they moved toward the entrance, Hannah suddenly broke away from her mother's side and ran to Mason. She reached up and took his hand, her small fingers barely wrapping halfway around his calloused palm. The simple gesture of trust hit Mason with unexpected force, like a physical blow to the chest. Hannah looked up at him, her green eyes solemn. "Thank you for saving my mama, Mr. Mason." Mason swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. "You're the one who saved her, Hannah. You were brave enough to get help." She considered this, then nodded gravely. "We saved her together." Together, such a simple word, but one that had been missing from Mason's vocabulary for longer than he cared to remember. He had brothers in the club, yes, but the kind of together that included a child's trust in a shared purpose beyond survival that had been absent from his life since the accident that took his family. As Mason led Hannah and Carla up the stairs to their temporary sanctuary, he felt something shift within him, like the first tentative melting of ice after a long winter. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the day after. He didn't know if Derek would stay away or if the law would finally hold him accountable. He didn't know if Carla and Hannah would stay for a week or a month before moving on to rebuild their lives elsewhere. But he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice in that moment at the diner when a little girl in a red dress had asked for help and he had risen to answer. Sometimes that was all a man could ask for, the clarity to recognize the right path when it appeared before him and the courage to take the first step. The apartment door opened to reveal a simple but clean space, a small kitchenette, a living area with a worn sofa, a bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. Victor had indeed done his best with fresh towels stacked on the coffee table and a vase of wildflowers clearly picked from behind the garage sitting on the kitchen counter. Carla stood in the center of the room, taking it all in with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "This is more than I expected," she admitted quietly. "Thank you." "It's not much," Mason replied, "but it's secure. No one gets in this building unless we want them to. That's all that matters right now." Carla's hand went unconsciously to the bruise on her face. "Just knowing he can't find us tonight." Hannah had already begun exploring opening cabinet doors and peering into the bedrooms. "Look, Mama, this room has 2 beds, one for you and one for me." Her excitement at such a simple thing, not having to share a bed in a cramped trailer, was both heartwarming and sobering. "Why don't you get settled in?" Mason suggested. "There's food in the fridge and the kitchen is stocked with basics. If you need anything else, just let one of us know. Someone is always downstairs in the garage during the day." Carla nodded, some of her initial tension beginning to ease. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know what would have happened if—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "You don't have to think about that now," Mason assured him. "You're safe here, both of you." As he turned to leave, Hannah called after him. "Mr. Mason, will you show me the garage later? Mama says I'm good with tools. I helped to fix our trailer door when the lock broke." The innocent request brought an unexpected smile to Mason's face. "Sure, kid, maybe tomorrow. You and your mama need to rest today." Hannah's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire countenance, revealing the carefree child beneath the layer of worry and fear. Tomorrow, she agreed solemnly as if they had made a sacred pact. Mason descended the stairs to find Bear waiting for him at the bottom. His friend's expression was knowing, almost amused. "What?" Mason asked defensively. Bear shook his head. "Nothing, just thinking it's been a while since I've seen you smile like that." Mason had no response to that observation. Instead, he changed the subject. "We should increase security for a few days. I don't think Derek knows about this place, but better safe than sorry." Bear nodded in agreement, allowing the deflection. "I'll talk to Riggs about setting up a rotation. And we should probably let the prospects know what's going on." The two men walked toward the garage where the sounds of work had already resumed, the clang of tools, the hiss of air compressors, the occasional curse as a stubborn bolt refused to budge. This was their world, one of grease and metal and the satisfaction of fixing broken things. It was a far cry from the battlefield where they had first met, but it provided its own kind of peace. As Mason picked up a wrench and slid beneath a Sportster that needed a new oil pan, he found his thoughts drifting upward to the apartment where a mother and daughter were beginning to believe in safety again. He wondered what Carla's story was beyond what little they knew. How had she ended up with a man like Derek? What had her life been like before? What dreams had she abandoned along the way? And Hannah, so brave, so resilient. A child shouldn't have to run for help while her mother was being beaten. A child shouldn't have to know what fear felt like. Yet here she was, still able to smile and ask about tools and motorcycles. Mason adjusted his grip on the wrench, focusing on the task at hand. One turn at a time, one problem solved, then on to the next. It was how he had survived after losing Emma and Sarah, by reducing life to its simplest components and addressing only what was directly in front of him. But as he worked beneath the motorcycle with the familiar smells of oil and metal surrounding him, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. It reminded him of his early days in the Marines, before disillusionment had set in, when he had truly believed in protecting the innocent and standing against those who would harm them. Perhaps some things were worth believing in again. Above him, in the apartment that had stood empty for too long, a little girl in a red dress unpacked her few treasured possessions, arranging them carefully in her new room. And Mason Cole, who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the world, found himself making silent promises to ensure she would never again have to run for help against the monsters who walked in human skin. Some oaths didn't need to be spoken aloud to bind a man's soul. Some promises once made in the quiet of one's heart could never be broken without breaking something essential within oneself. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long rectangles of light across the garage floor, Mason worked beneath the motorcycle and made such a promise, not knowing how it would change his life, but knowing he could do nothing else. 3 days had passed since Carla and Hannah moved into the apartment above the Iron Wolves garage. The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds, catching motes of dust that danced in golden shafts of light. Mason stood in the workshop below, hands braced against a workbench, as he studied the day's repair schedule scribbled on the chalkboard wall. The comforting sense of motor oil, metal, and leather surrounded him, a familiar backdrop to his thoughts. The sound of small feet on the metal stairs drew his attention. Hannah appeared at the bottom step, her red sneakers paired with overalls that were a size too large, clearly handed down or donated. Her light brown hair had been pulled back into a somewhat uneven ponytail, likely her own handiwork. "Mr. Mason," she called, clutching something to her chest. "Mama said I could come down if I promised not to touch anything without asking." Mason's weathered face softened as he turned toward her. "Morning, kid. Your mom's still sleeping." Hannah nodded, approaching cautiously, eyes wide, as she took in the array of motorcycles in various states of repair. "She worked late last night. Doc let her help organize the medicine cabinet." The girl stopped before Mason, holding up a small toolbox painted fire engine red. "I brought my tools. Can you show me how to fix something today?" "You promised." The toolbox was clearly a child's toy, but Mason treated it with the gravity of a professional offering. He crouched down to examine it, noting the careful way Hannah handled her prized possession. "Well, now, that's a fine set of tools you've got there. Let's see what we're working with." He opened the lid to find a collection of plastic tools alongside a few real ones that had likely been deemed safe enough for a child. Among them was a real screwdriver, its handle worn smooth from use. This looks like it's seen some work. It was my daddy's, Hannah said solemnly. Mama let me have it when I turned 6 because I'm responsible. She pronounced the word carefully, each syllable deliberate. I fixed our trailer door with it once. The screws got loose. Mason nodded, recognizing the pride in her voice. Children needed to feel useful, capable. His own daughter Emma had been the same way, always wanting to help in his garage at home. The memory came without the usual sharp pain, softened somehow by Hannah's presence. Well, I could use a responsible assistant today. See that bicycle over there? He pointed to an old Schwinn leaning against the far wall. The chain keeps slipping off. Think we could take a look at it together. Hannah's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire countenance. She nodded eagerly, clutching her toolbox tighter. I can help. I'm strong. I bet you are. Mason led her over to the bicycle, aware of Bear watching them from across the garage with an expression that hovered between amusement and concern. His friend had been unusually quiet since they'd brought Carla and Hannah to the clubhouse, keeping his observations to himself, but clearly processing the situation in his own way. Mason positioned the bicycle on its stand and began explaining the basics to Hannah, showing her how the chain connected to the gears and how to check for loose links. She listened with intense concentration, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions for a 7-year-old. When he handed her the proper wrench to tighten the rear wheel axle nuts, she handled it with careful determination. You've done this before, Mason observed, as she positioned the wrench correctly on the first try. Daddy taught me some things before he went to heaven, she said matter-of-factly, her small face serious. Mama says I remember good. The garage door opened, letting in a shaft of bright sunlight that momentarily blinded them. Doc entered carrying a cardboard tray of coffee cups from the diner down the street. His eyebrows raised at the sight of Hannah working on the bicycle, but he said nothing as he set the coffee on the workbench. Got you the usual, Mason, he said, passing over a large black coffee, and a hot chocolate for the junior mechanic if her mother approves. Hannah's eyes widened at the treat. Mama lets me have hot chocolate sometimes. Can I go ask her? She's awake? Doc confirmed. Just saw her upstairs. Said to tell you breakfast is almost ready. Hannah carefully placed the wrench back in her toolbox, closed the lid, and looked up at Mason. Can we finish fixing the bike after breakfast? It'll be waiting right here, Mason promised. Go on now. Don't let your food get cold. She ran toward the stairs, then stopped abruptly and turned back. Thank you, Mr. Mason, for teaching me about the chain and the gears and stuff. Without waiting for a response, she dashed up the stairs, her footsteps echoing on the metal treads. Doc watched her go, then turned to Mason with a raised eyebrow. Looks like you've got yourself an apprentice. Mason shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee to avoid responding directly. The truth was, Hannah's eager presence stirred something inside him that he'd thought long buried. Teaching her about the bicycle had felt natural right somehow, in a way that little had felt right since he'd lost his family. How's Carla doing? He asked instead, changing the subject. Doc leaned against the workbench. Better. The bruising is fading. She's a tough one. Organized my entire medical supplies last night, labeled everything. She knows her stuff. He paused, studying Mason over the rim of his coffee cup. She's worried about Derek getting out. Keeps asking if there's been any news. Mason nodded grimly. I called the station yesterday. Officer Reynolds said they're holding him on assault and drug possession, but his lawyer is already working on bail. Could be out as early as today. Damn. Doc shook his head. What's the plan then? Before Mason could answer, Bear walked over from the far side of the garage where he'd been working on a customer's Sportster. The big man wiped his hands on a shop rag, his expression troubled. Just got a call from Riggs, he said, referring to their club president. Derek made bail an hour ago, posted by someone else, not himself. Mason's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Who? Don't know, but Riggs has a buddy at the courthouse who says Derek was picked up by a couple of guys in a black pickup. Didn't recognize them, but they looked like trouble. The three men exchanged grim looks, understanding the implications. Derek wasn't just an angry ex-boyfriend anymore. He had friends, connections, resources. The simple act of kindness that had brought Carla and Hannah to their clubhouse had just become considerably more complicated. We should tell her, Doc said quietly. She needs to know. Mason nodded, setting down his coffee. I'll do it. You two keep an eye on things down here. As Mason climbed the metal stairs to the apartment, he felt a familiar tension settle between his shoulder blades. It was the same feeling he had had in the military before entering hostile territory, a heightened awareness, a readiness for trouble. He hadn't expected to feel it again in civilian life, certainly not in the small town where the Iron Wolves had established their peaceful existence. He knocked on the apartment door, hearing Hannah's cheerful voice call out, "Who is it?" "It's Mason, Hannah." The door swung open to reveal Hannah's beaming face. "Mama made pancakes. Do you want some? They're really good with syrup." Over her head, Mason could see Carla standing at the small kitchenette, spatula in hand. She wore jeans and a simple blue t-shirt that brought out the green in her eyes. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish purple, less angry than before. Her copper hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing the clean lines of her face. She looked more rested than she had 3 days ago, some of the haunted tension gone from her expression. "Good morning, Mason," she said, offering a tentative smile. "Would you like to join us for breakfast? It's the least I can do to thank you all for everything." Mason stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "The pancakes smell great, but I need to talk to you about something first. Hannah, do you think you could take your breakfast into your room for a few minutes? I need to have a grown-up conversation with your mom." Hannah's smile faltered, her gaze darting between Mason and her mother. Children who grew up in households with violence developed a sixth sense for trouble, Mason knew. She was already picking up on his tension. "It's okay, sweetheart," Carla reassured her, though her own expression had grown wary. "Take your plate and go eat at your desk. You can work on that drawing you started yesterday." Hannah reluctantly took her plate of pancakes and disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind her, but not before giving Mason one last searching look. Once they were alone, Carla set down the spatula and turned to face Mason fully. "He's out, isn't he?" she asked directly, her voice steady despite the fear that flashed in her eyes. Mason nodded, respecting her enough not to sugarcoat the truth. "Made bail about an hour ago. I'm sorry, Carla." She closed her eyes, briefly absorbing the news. When she opened them again, there was a resigned determination in her gaze. "I knew it would happen eventually. The system always lets men like him walk. I just hoped—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "How long do we have before he finds us here?" "We don't know that he will," Mason said, though they both understood the hollow optimism in his words. "He always does," Carla replied simply. "It's what he does. I've moved 3 times in the past year, changed my phone number twice. Somehow he always finds us." Mason moved closer, keeping his voice low so Hannah wouldn't overhear. "This time is different. You're not alone anymore. The Iron Wolves aren't exactly easy to intimidate." A small, sad smile touched Carla's lips. "I appreciate that, Mason. I really do. But you don't know Derek. He's obsessive and he has friends in bad places." She glanced toward Hannah's door. "I can't put all of you at risk. Maybe we should leave, find somewhere else before he tracks us here." "And go where?" Mason asked gently. "Another strange town, another temporary home." "How long can you keep running?" Saw Carla. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mason had seen the toll that constant vigilance took on soldiers in combat zones. Carla and Hannah had been living in their own private war zone for too long. Before she could answer, a commotion erupted from downstairs, the sound of raised voices and heavy footsteps. Mason's hand instinctively went to his hip, where a sidearm would have been during his Marine days. Old habits. "Stay here," he instructed, moving quickly to the door. "Lock it behind me." He descended the stairs rapidly, taking in the scene below, with a tactical sweep of his eyes. Bear and Doc stood shoulder to shoulder near the main entrance, blocking access to a man Mason didn't recognize. The stranger wore a sheriff's deputy uniform, his hand resting casually on his holster, in a posture that was more threat than caution. "What's going on here?" Mason asked, joining his brothers at the entrance. The deputy, a man in his 40s with cold eyes and a forgettable face, shifted his gaze to Mason. "I'm looking for Carla West and her daughter. Got reports they might be staying here." Mason kept his expression neutral, though alarm bells were ringing in his head. "And you are Deputy Hargrove County Sheriff's Department." The man made no move to produce identification. "We need to speak with Ms. West regarding an ongoing investigation." Doc, always the most diplomatic of the three, spoke up. "What kind of investigation requires you to show up at our private property without a warrant, Deputy?" Hargrove's mouth tightened. "That's official police business. Now, are they here or not? Mason exchanged a quick glance with Bear, whose subtle headshake confirmed what Mason was already thinking: something wasn't right. The county sheriff's department had no jurisdiction in town limits, and this deputy hadn't shown up in a marked vehicle. Through the open garage door, Mason could see a black pickup truck parked across the street. "If you have official business with anyone," Mason said carefully, "I suggest you go through proper channels. Contact Officer Reynolds at the town police. He's handling any issues related to the incident at the trailer park." A flash of annoyance crossed the deputy's face. "This is a separate matter. Ms. West is wanted for questioning in a narcotics case." The lie was so transparent that Mason almost laughed. Instead, he straightened to his full height, using his body language to establish dominance in a way that harked back to his military training. "Deputy, I'm going to need to see some identification and a warrant. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave private property." Hargrove's hand tightened on his holster, but he seemed to think better of escalating the situation when he looked past Mason and saw 3 more Iron Wolves members emerging from the back of the garage. The odds were no longer in his favor. "I'll be back," he said, the threat evident in his tone. "With a warrant and enough manpower to search every inch of this place." "You do that," Bear rumbled, his massive frame blocking most of the doorway, "and we'll have our lawyer waiting." The deputy retreated to the black pickup, where Mason could now see 2 figures waiting in the cab. As the truck pulled away, Doc quickly wrote down the license plate number. "That wasn't a real deputy," he said grimly. "The uniform was close, but the badge was wrong. County deputies have 7-point stars, not 6. Mason nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Reynolds. Bear, get Riggs on the phone. We need to lock down the clubhouse." He turned to the other members who had gathered. "Vic, take the rear entrance. Tank, watch the street. Nobody in or out without clearance from me or Riggs." As the men dispersed to their assignments, Mason completed his call to Officer Reynolds, quickly explaining the situation. Reynolds promised to send a patrol car immediately and to check on the deputy's credentials, though he echoed Doc's suspicion that the man was likely an imposter. By the time Mason returned upstairs, he found Carla standing just inside the apartment door, her face pale but composed. She clearly heard enough of the confrontation to understand what was happening. "It was Derek, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. "One of his friends pretending to be a cop." Mason nodded, not seeing the point in hiding the truth. "Looks that way, but they're gone now, and we've got people watching all the entrances. Reynolds is sending a patrol car too." Carla hugged herself, eyes fixed on a point beyond Mason's shoulder. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. He's escalating, using fake police now. What's next? Actually bribing real ones." She shook her head. "We need to leave before someone gets hurt because of us." "That's not happening," Mason said firmly. "You and Hannah are staying right here where we can protect you." "Protect us?" Carla's voice rose slightly before she caught herself glancing toward Hannah's door. In a lower tone, she continued, "You don't understand what he's capable of, Mason. If he can't get to me legally, he'll find another way. He always does." Mason took a step closer, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "Carla, listen to me. I've dealt with men like Derek before in the Marines and after. Bullies, abusers, men who think their strength gives them power over others. They all have one thing in common: they're cowards at heart. They only have power when their victims are isolated alone." He gestured toward the window where they could see Iron Wolves members taking up positions around the property. "You're not alone anymore. We're not just some random bikers who helped you out. We're brothers who served together, fought together. We know how to handle threats." Carla's green eyes searched his face, looking for reassurance, but also for truth. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know us." The question caught Mason off guard. Why was he doing this? Why had the sight of a little girl in a red dress running into a diner changed everything in an instant? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because sometimes people need more than just a moment of kindness. They need someone to stand with them until the storm passes." Something shifted in Carla's expression, a softening around her eyes that suggested his words had reached her. Before she could respond, Hannah's bedroom door opened and the little girl peered out cautiously. "Mama, is everything okay?" I heard loud voices. Carla quickly composed herself, offering her daughter a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Mr. Mason's friends were just being a little noisy downstairs." Hannah looked skeptical, her gaze moving to Mason for confirmation. He nodded, adding, "Some of the guys were arguing about a baseball game. You know how grown-ups can get sometimes." This seemed to satisfy her. "Can I go back downstairs with you now? You said we could finish fixing the bike." Mason looked to Carla, who hesitated only briefly before nodding her permission. "Just stay inside the garage, Hannah. Don't go outside for any reason, okay?" "Okay, Mama." Hannah retrieved her red toolbox and moved to Mason's side, slipping her small hand into his with the easy trust of childhood. "I'm ready." Mason felt the weight of that small hand in his like an anchor to something he'd thought lost forever. The simple gesture of trust from this child, who had already endured too much uncertainty in her young life, stirred a protective instinct so fierce it almost took his breath away. As they descended the stairs, Mason could hear Bear's deep voice on the phone with Riggs describing the encounter with the fake deputy. The atmosphere in the garage had changed, charged now with a vigilant tension that reminded Mason of forward operating bases he'd known in hostile territory. The Iron Wolves were on alert, their usual casual demeanor replaced by the focused readiness of men who had faced danger before and knew how to prepare for it. Mason led Hannah to the bicycle they'd been working on earlier, purposely positioning her in a corner of the garage where she couldn't see the main entrance or the worried expressions of the other members. He needed to keep her distracted to preserve what childhood innocence remained despite all she'd already witnessed. "All right, junior mechanic," he said, keeping his voice light. "Let's see if we can get this chain back on track." For the next half hour, Mason guided Hannah through the process of adjusting the rear derailleur and properly tensioning the bicycle chain. Her small fingers proved nimble at handling the finer adjustments, and her face glowed with pride when they finally tested the gears and found everything working smoothly. "We fixed it," she exclaimed, clapping her hands in delight. "Can I ride it?" Mason glanced around the garage, considering. It wasn't safe for her to go outside, but the interior space was clear enough for a short ride. "Just around the inside of the garage, okay? Nice and slow." He adjusted the seat to accommodate her height and helped her mount the bicycle. Her feet barely reached the pedals, but she managed to push off and begin a wobbly circuit of the open area. Mason watched her carefully, ready to catch her if she lost balance, but Hannah proved to be a determined cyclist, despite her inexperience. "Look at me, Mr. Mason," she called, gaining confidence with each revolution of the pedals. "I'm riding a real bike." "You sure are, kid," he replied, unable to suppress a smile at her enthusiasm. It was a bright moment in an otherwise tense day, a reminder of why they were all on high alert in the first place. Not just to oppose a man like Derek, but to protect this child's right to simple joys, like riding a bicycle without fear. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a police cruiser outside, its lights flashing but siren silent. Mason signaled to Hannah to stop riding and helped her dismount, then guided her toward the stairs. "Why don't you go show your mom how well you did with the bike?" he suggested. "I need to talk to the police officers for a minute." Hannah's expression clouded with concern. "Is it about the bad man, the one who hurt Mama?" Children saw more than adults often gave them credit for. Mason crouched down to her level, looking directly into her worried green eyes. "It's just some grown-up business, Hannah. Nothing for you to worry about. Your job is to take care of your mom and tell her about fixing the bike, okay?" She nodded solemnly, clutching her toolbox close to her chest like a shield. "Okay, Mr. Mason, but you'll be careful, right?" "I promise." "I promise," he said, the words feeling like a vow that extended far beyond this moment. "Now go on upstairs. I'll come check on you both later." As Hannah climbed the stairs, Mason turned his attention to the front of the garage where Officer Reynolds was now speaking with Baron Doc. The young officer looked troubled, his usual professional demeanor strained by whatever news he was delivering. "What's the situation?" Mason asked as he joined them. Reynolds glanced around the garage, noting the strategic positioning of the Iron Wolves members. "I see you're already on alert. That's good. The man who came here wasn't a deputy. Hargrove is a real name, but he was discharged from the county force 2 years ago for misconduct." "Let me guess," Doc interjected. "Drug-related," Reynolds nodded grimly. "He was suspected of tipping off dealers about raids in exchange for payoffs. Nothing ever stuck legally, but they pushed him out." He lowered his voice. "Here's the concerning part. He's been seen around town with known associates of a small-time drug ring. Local dealers, nothing major, but they're connected to a larger operation based out of the city." Mason exchanged glances with Bear and Doc. The pieces were starting to fall into place. And Derek is part of this operation? We think so, Reynolds confirmed. When we searched him after the incident at the trailer, we found more than just a personal stash of cocaine. The quantity and packaging suggested he was dealing. But here's what's really troubling. His lawyer showed up less than an hour after booking. Expensive suit city firm. Not the kind of representation a small-time dealer could afford. The implications were clear. Derek wasn't just a violent ex-boyfriend. He was connected to something larger, something that apparently valued him enough to send resources for his defense and retrieval. So now we're not just dealing with an angry ex, Bear rumbled. We've got drug dealers involved. Reynolds adjusted his utility belt, a nervous habit that betrayed his concern despite his professional demeanor. I've requested additional patrols for this area, but frankly, our department is stretched thin. The best I can promise is drive-bys every hour or so. We appreciate that, Mason said, understanding the limitations of a small-town police force. We can handle ourselves in the meantime. The officer nodded, then hesitated before adding, there's one more thing. Derek was asking questions at his bail hearing about custody rights, claiming Hannah is his daughter and that Carla kidnapped her. Mason felt a cold anger settling in his chest. Is she his daughter? According to our records, no. Hannah's birth certificate lists another man as the father, deceased military, but Derek's lawyer is pushing for a paternity test claiming Carla falsified documents. It was a classic abuser tactic, using the legal system and children as weapons to maintain control over their victims. Mason had seen it before with other veterans' families, the ugly aftermath of relationships turned toxic. Does Carla know about this yet? Reynolds shook his head. I wanted to talk to you all first, get a sense of the security situation here. He glanced around again at the Iron Wolves on guard. Seems like you've got that covered. I'll speak with her before I leave, explain the legal options. Mason walked Reynolds to the base of the stairs, then paused. Officer, there's something else you should know. Carla mentioned that Derek might have been involved in her sister's death, a domestic violence case that never led to charges due to lack of evidence. The officer's eyebrows rose. That wasn't in his record. Do you know where this happened? No details yet. She's still opening up about it slowly. Trust doesn't come easy to her for good reason. Reynolds nodded in understanding. If you get more information, let me know immediately. Prior violence of that nature could help us build a stronger case to keep him away from her and Hannah. He hesitated, then added more quietly, off the record, Mason. Be careful. Men like Derek, when they feel cornered or humiliated, they can become unpredictable, especially with drug connections in the mix. We've handled worse, Mason assured him, though privately he shared the officer's concern. Unpredictable enemies were the most dangerous kind. After Reynolds departed, promising to return later with any updates, Mason convened an impromptu meeting with the Iron Wolves members present. They gathered in a tight circle near the back of the garage, voices low, but determined as they discussed security measures and watch rotations. These men had faced danger before in war zones and on the dangerous highways of America. They knew how to prepare, how to protect their own. 2 men on watch at all times, Riggs instructed, having arrived during Reynolds' visit. The club president's silver beard and weathered face gave him the look of a seasoned commander, which he had been during his time in the Army. No one rides alone until this is resolved, and I want daily check-ins from everyone, no exceptions. The members nodded in solemn agreement. Despite their rough appearance and outsider status in the town, the Iron Wolves operated with a disciplined code that would have impressed any military officer. Brotherhood, loyalty, protection of the innocent, these weren't just words to them, but guiding principles forged in combat and tempered by civilian life. As the meeting concluded, Mason became aware of a presence at the top of the stairs. Carla stood watching them, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and guilt. She descended slowly, approaching the group with a quiet dignity that belied the bruises still visible on her face. Officer Reynolds told me everything, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes, about Derek's custody claims and his connections. I want you all to know how grateful I am for what you're doing, but I can't ask you to put yourselves at risk like this. Riggs stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. Ma'am, you didn't ask, we offered. And the Iron Wolves don't go back on their word. But this is more than you signed up for, Carla persisted. Derek isn't just some angry ex now. He's connected to drug dealers, maybe worse. People could get hurt. People already got hurt, Bear pointed out, gesturing to her fading bruises. You. And if we hadn't stepped in, who knows what would have happened to Hannah. Some risks are worth taking. Mason watched the exchange with a growing sense of certainty. This wasn't just about doing a good deed anymore. It had evolved into something more significant, a stand against the kind of predatory violence that destroyed lives and shattered families. For men like them who had seen the worst of humanity in war zones and came home to find that evil existed in small towns too, this was a battle worth fighting. Carla, he said, drawing her attention, Reynolds mentioned something about your sister, that Derek might have been involved in her death. The color drained from Carla's face, her composure cracking for the first time since she'd approached them. He told you that, just that you'd mentioned it, no details. Mason kept his tone gentle but direct. If there's something we should know, something that might help build a case against Derek. Carla's hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to still the motion. It was 3 years ago. My sister Melissa was dating Derek before me. I didn't know. I had no idea what he was really like when we met after she died. She took a shaky breath. The official ruling was accidental overdose, but Melissa never did drugs. Never. And there were bruises they said happened during CPR attempts, but I'm a nurse. I know what those look like versus other kinds. The garage had fallen completely silent, every man present giving Carla their full attention. This was no longer an abstract threat. It was a pattern of violence that had already claimed one life. Did you tell the police your suspicions? Doc asked gently. Carla nodded, a bitter smile touching her lips. They investigated, briefly, but Derek had an alibi for that night, friends who swore he was with them. And with no direct evidence, they closed the case. Her voice hardened. 3 months later, he asked me out, said he wanted to help me through my grief since we both loved Melissa. I had no idea. I was so blind. Mason felt a cold rage building inside him, the kind of controlled fury he'd learned to channel during combat. Derek wasn't just an abuser, he was a predator who had deliberately targeted a vulnerable woman grieving her sister, a sister he might have killed. That's why you ran when he became violent, Bear said, understanding dawning on his face. You realize what might have happened to Melissa? Yes, Carla whispered. The first time he hit me, it was like a veil lifted. I saw everything clearly, how he'd isolated me from friends, how he'd slowly taken control of our finances, our social life, just like he did with Melissa. She straightened her shoulders. I packed a bag that night while he was passed out drunk. Hannah and I have been running ever since. The revelation hung in the air, heavy with implication. If Derek had indeed killed Carla's sister and gotten away with it, what wouldn't he do to reclaim control over Carla and Hannah? Riggs broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made. You're not running anymore, Carla. Not you, not Hannah. The Iron Wolves stand with you until this is finished, one way or another. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled men. In their expressions, Mason saw the same resolute determination that had carried them through firefights and ambushes in distant lands. This wasn't just charity or chivalry, it was justice, long delayed but no less necessary. Carla looked around at their faces, these men who had become unexpected allies in her desperate fight for safety. Whatever doubts or objections she might have had seemed to fade in the face of their unified support. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. All of you. From upstairs came the sound of a door opening, followed by Hannah's voice calling down. Mama, are you down there? I'm hungry. The tension broke, several of the men chuckling at the child's perfect timing. Life's basic needs continued regardless of crises or confrontations. I should go make her lunch, Carla said, smiling despite the heaviness of their conversation. And maybe enough sandwiches for all of you too if you're hungry. Never turn down a home-cooked meal, Tank said with a grin, the first words the usually quiet member had spoken all day. Even if it's just sandwiches. As Carla headed back upstairs, Mason felt a hand on his shoulder. Bear stood beside him, his expression unusually somber. This just got a lot more complicated, his friend said quietly. If Derek really killed her sister, then he won't stop until he either gets Carla and Hannah back or eliminates the threat they pose to him, Mason finished grimly. I know. You thinking what I'm thinking, Mason nodded slowly. We need to go on offense. Find out exactly who Derek is connected to and what he's planning next. He glanced around at their brother's men who had faced death in distant deserts and returned changed but unbroken. If it's a war he wants, we'll give him one. Bear's grip on his shoulder tightened briefly before releasing. Just like old times, brother. Just like old times. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garage floor, the Iron Wolves continued their preparations. Weapons were checked and secured in strategic locations. Communication protocols were established. Security cameras were adjusted to cover blind spots around the perimeter. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had trained for crisis, who understood that sometimes peace must be defended with the readiness for violence. Upstairs, Hannah's laughter floated down through the open windows as Carla presumably made lunch. The sound was a poignant reminder of exactly what was at stake. Not just two lives, but the possibility of joy and normalcy after trauma. The chance for a little girl to grow up without fear shadowing her every step. Mason checked his phone, finding a text message from Officer Reynolds. Court granted emergency protection order for C and H. Being delivered to D now. Stay alert. He showed the message to Bear and Doc, all of them understanding that the protection order, while a positive legal step, might only serve to enrage Derek further. Paper shields offered little protection against determined malice. I'll tell Carla when she comes back down, Mason decided. For now, let her and Hannah have a peaceful lunch. They've had enough worry for one day. Doc nodded in agreement. I'll reach out to some of my contacts at the VA hospital. See if anyone knows anything about this drug operation Derek might be connected to. Knowledge is power, especially when you're outgunned. As his friends dispersed to their assigned tasks, Mason found himself alone near the bicycle he and Hannah had repaired together. He ran his hand along the handlebar, thinking about the joy on her face as she'd pedaled around the garage. Such a simple pleasure, yet one she'd clearly been denied in her short life of constant movement and fear. In that moment, Mason made a silent vow that extended far beyond temporary shelter or protection. Hannah deserved a childhood free from terror. Carla deserved a life where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. And if achieving that meant confronting the darkness in Derek and his associates, then so be it. Some battles chose you regardless of whether you sought them out. The sound of a motorcycle approaching drew Mason's attention to the street outside. Through the open garage door, he watched as a familiar bike pulled up Preacher, returning from his reconnaissance mission around town. The lean, tattooed veteran dismounted quickly and strode into the garage, his expression confirming that he brought news and not the good kind. Derek's holed up at the Wayward Inn on the edge of town, he reported without preamble. Room 17, he's not alone either. Counted at least 3 other men coming and going, including that fake deputy. Mason absorbed this information with the calm assessment of a seasoned tactician. Any signs they're planning something? Preacher nodded grimly. They loaded up a black SUV about 20 minutes ago. Couldn't see what with, but they were careful about it, acting like men with a mission. The warning bells in Mason's mind grew louder. Men like Derek didn't gather reinforcements and supplies unless they were planning something significant. The emergency protection order might have accelerated their timeline, forcing them to act before legal consequences further complicated their situation. Get rigs, Mason instructed. We need to prepare for potential trouble tonight. He glanced toward the stairs leading to the apartment where Carla and Hannah were having their lunch, blissfully unaware of the gathering storm. And we need to make contingency plans just in case. As Preacher moved to find their president, Mason stared out at the street beyond the garage, watching as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the pavement. Somewhere out there, a man who had already destroyed too many lives was planning his next move. But this time his target wasn't isolated or undefended. This time she had the Iron Wolves standing with her, and Mason Cole had rediscovered something he thought he'd lost forever in the ashes of his own tragedy, a cause worth fighting for, and the fierce determination to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. The coming night might bring danger, but it would find them ready to protect what was precious. Ready to stand against the darkness that men like Derek brought into the world. Ready to prove that sometimes the most unexpected guardians were the ones wearing leather vests and riding Harleys, their rough exteriors, hiding hearts that still believed in justice and brotherhood, and in the simple right of a child to ride her bicycle without fear. The evening shadows stretched long across the garage floor as the Iron Wolves finalized their security preparations. Outside, twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple and orange, the last light of day surrendering to the approaching night. Mason stood at the window of the apartment above the garage, watching as the town settled into evening routines, lights flickering on in distant windows, unaware of the tension building within the walls of the Iron Wolves clubhouse. Behind him, Carla moved quietly around the small kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, while Hannah sat at the table focused intently on a drawing. The domesticity of the scene struck Mason with unexpected force. In just a few days, this space that had stood empty for months had transformed into something resembling a home. "Mr. Mason," Hannah called, looking up from her artwork. "Come see what I drew." Mason crossed the room to stand beside her chair, looking down at the colorful crayon drawing. It showed a row of motorcycles parked in front of what appeared to be the garage. Behind them stood several figures in black vests, and in front, holding hands with the smallest figure in a red dress, was a tall man with what looked like a beard. "That's you," Hannah explained, pointing to the bearded figure. "And that's me, and that's Mama, and those are all your friends protecting us from the bad man." Her small finger traced over another figure drawn at a distance from the group, colored in dark, angry scribbles. Mason felt something tighten in his chest at the child's simple understanding of their situation. Even at 7, she comprehended more than they'd realized. "It's a great drawing, Hannah," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "You got Bear's beard just right." She beamed at the praise, then returned to adding details to her picture. Mason caught Carla watching them, a complicated expression on her face. Gratitude mingled with something deeper, perhaps concern about the attachment her daughter was forming to these unexpected protectors. Mason's phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Riggs. "Meeting downstairs, now." "I need to talk with the guys for a few minutes," Mason told Carla, keeping his tone casual for Hannah's benefit. "You two okay up here?" Carla nodded, her eyes communicating that she understood more was happening than he was saying. "We're fine. Dinner will be ready soon if you want to join us." Mason descended the metal stairs to find the main members of Iron Wolves gathered in the back office of the garage. Riggs stood at the center, his silver beard and weathered face grave in the fluorescent lighting. Doc Bear, Tank Preacher, and several others formed a tight circle around a table covered with a town map. "What's the situation?" Mason asked, closing the door behind him. Riggs looked up, his expression grim. "Preacher's contact at the Wayward Inn just called. Derek and his crew checked out about 20 minutes ago. 4 men, 2 vehicles, the black pickup, and an SUV. They loaded up with duffel bags and what looked like baseball bats." A chill settled over Mason. "They're making a move." "Looks that way," Bear confirmed. "Officer Reynolds called too. The protection order was delivered to Derek at the motel an hour ago. He apparently tore it up in front of the server and said something about taking care of things his own way." The implication was clear. The legal notice, rather than deterring Derek, had only served to escalate the situation, pushing him toward direct action. "What's the plan?" Mason asked, addressing Riggs, but his eyes moving to the map spread across the table. The club president traced a finger along the streets surrounding their location. "We've secured the perimeter, all access points covered, security cameras online. If they come here, we'll be ready." He looked up, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "But we need to be clear about something. These aren't just some barroom troublemakers. If they come armed, this could get serious fast." The room fell silent as each man processed the implications. They'd faced danger before in war zones and on hostile roads, but this was different. This was their home, their sanctuary. "I called in some reinforcements," Riggs continued after a moment. 3 more members are on their way from the next county. Should be here within the hour. In the meantime, I want 2 men on each entry point. Full alert status." As Riggs assigned positions, Mason studied the map, his mind working through tactical scenarios with the precision ingrained by military training. The clubhouse had 3 potential entry points: the main garage doors facing the street, the side door near the stairwell, and the rear exit that opened onto the alley behind. Each had its vulnerabilities, each needed coverage. "What about Carla and Hannah?" Doc asked, voicing the concern uppermost in everyone's mind. "If things go sideways, they're the most vulnerable." Mason straightened, having already considered this problem. "We need a fallback position, somewhere we can move them quickly if necessary." He turned to Riggs. "What about the old storage room behind the office steel door? No windows, easily defensible." Riggs nodded in approval. "Good thinking. We can clear it out, make it ready just in case." "Tank Vic, that's your job. Chiamon, as the meeting concluded and members moved to their assigned positions, Mason felt a hand on his shoulder. Bear stood beside him, his expression unusually solemn. "You thinking about calling Reynolds?" his friend asked quietly. "Getting official help?" Mason considered the question carefully. The local police would respond if called, but their numbers were limited and their response time could be crucial minutes too slow. More importantly, involving them now might trigger a confrontation they weren't prepared for. Not yet, he decided. Reynolds knows the situation. He's already increased patrols in the area. If we call them in now and Derek's crew spots police presence, they might accelerate whatever they're planning or change tactics. Better to stay alert and call only if we confirm an immediate threat. Bear nodded in agreement. Like old times, brother, we watch, we wait, we respond when necessary. The two men moved toward the main garage area where other members were already taking up defensive positions. The atmosphere had changed, the casual camaraderie of the clubhouse replaced by the focused vigilance of men preparing for potential combat. Gun cabinets were unlocked, weapons checked and loaded with practiced efficiency, then secured within easy reach at strategic points. Mason found himself checking his watch, calculating time and distance. If Derek and his crew had left the motel 20 minutes ago, they could be anywhere by now. Perhaps they were simply leaving town, recognizing that the Iron Wolves presented too formidable an obstacle. But Mason's instincts told him otherwise. Men like Derek didn't retreat. They escalated until forced to stop. The sound of footsteps on the metal stairs drew everyone's attention. Carla appeared, her expression tense as she took in the scene below, the positioned men, the charged atmosphere. "Something's happening," she said. It wasn't a question. Mason moved to the base of the stairs, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Just precautions." Derek checked out of his motel room. "Could be nothing, could be something. We're making sure we're prepared either way." Carla's hands tightened on the stair railing. "He's coming here, isn't he? I can feel it." There was no point in false reassurance. Mason nodded once. "Possibly, but we're ready if he does." She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this confirmation of her fears. When she opened them again, there was a steely determination that hadn't been there before. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep Hannah calm and occupied. Pack a small bag with essentials, medication, important documents, anything you can't leave behind. If we need to move you quickly to a safer location, I want you ready." Carla nodded, her nurse's training evident in her composed response to crisis. "I can do that, and I can help if anyone gets hurt. I have experience with trauma care." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Mason said, though they both knew hope was a fragile defense against men like Derek. As Carla returned upstairs, Mason rejoined Bear at the front of the garage where they had a clearer view of the street through partially closed doors. The evening had fully settled now, streetlights casting pools of yellow illumination on the empty sidewalks. Nothing moved except an occasional passing car, residents returning home for the night. "You know what bothers me?" Bear said quietly, his eyes scanning the street. "The timing. Why now? The protection order is a nuisance, sure, but not enough to trigger this kind of response. There's something else at play." Mason had been considering the same question. Maybe it's not just about Carla and Hannah anymore. Maybe it's about us, the Iron Wolves. We interfered in his business, humiliated him in front of his crew. For a man like Derek, that's unforgivable. Bear grunted in agreement. Ego and control. Dangerous combination. The radio clipped to Mason's belt, crackled to life. Preacher's voice came through, tense but controlled. "Movement at the south corner. Black pickup just parked 2 blocks down. 2 males exiting, moving on foot toward our position." Mason and Bear exchanged glances. It was starting. "Roger that," Mason responded. "Maintain visual. Do not engage unless threatened." He switched channels to alert Riggs, who was covering the rear entrance with Doc. "Possible contact approaching from south. 2 men on foot, likely advanced scouts. Black pickup parked 2 blocks out." "Understood," came Riggs's calm reply. "We're ready back here. Any sign of the SUV?" "Negative. Stay alert." Mason moved quickly to the side entrance where Tank and another member Hawk were positioned. "We've got movement south of our position. They may be trying to assess our security before the main group approaches. Watch for flanking maneuvers." Tank nodded grimly, adjusting his position to better cover the side door while remaining out of sight from the windows. The big man had served as a tank gunner in Iraq, hence his nickname, and had the steady nerves of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. Mason returned to the front, joining Bear at a position that offered a good view of the street while keeping them concealed from outside observation. Through a gap in the partially closed garage doors, they watched as two figures appeared at the edge of the nearest streetlight's glow. "That's the fake deputy," Bear muttered, recognizing the first man. "Hargrove." The second man was unfamiliar, shorter but muscular, moving with the cautious swagger of someone looking for trouble, but wary of finding more than he bargained for. Both men paused across the street, studying the clubhouse with calculated interest. Mason's radio crackled again. Preacher's voice was barely above a whisper. "Second vehicle spotted. Black SUV circling the block behind our position. 4 occupants visible." So it was coordinated as Mason had suspected. The 2 men on foot were indeed scouts assessing their defenses while the main force prepared to approach from behind. A classic pincer movement that suggested more tactical thinking than he'd expected from Derek's crew. "They're not just angry," Bear observed, reading Mason's thoughts. "They're organized." "Which means this isn't just about getting Carla back," Mason concluded. "This is about sending a message, establishing territory." Before Bear could respond, the radio came alive once more, this time with Tank's urgent voice. "Movement at East Alley. 2 men approaching the back exit. One carrying what looks like a baseball bat, the other has something in his waistband, possibly a firearm." The situation was escalating quickly. Mason made a rapid decision. "Riggs dock, hold position at the rear but stay out of sight. Let's see what they're planning before we show our hand. Everyone else maintain current positions, weapons ready but concealed. No one engages unless directly threatened or on my command." As the Iron Wolves acknowledged his orders, Mason felt the familiar focus of combat readiness settling over him. Time seemed to slow, his senses sharpening as adrenaline coursed through his system. He could hear Bear's measured breathing beside him, feel the weight of the Glock secured in the holster under his vest, smell the lingering sense of motor oil and leather that permeated the garage. Outside, Hargrove and his companion had crossed the street and were now approaching the main entrance with deliberate casualness, as if they were just passing by. But their attentive posture and the way their hands remained free and ready betrayed their true purpose. Mason touched his radio once more. "All positions, they're making their move. Stand by." A loud banging on the front doors shattered the tense silence. Hargrove's voice called out with false joviality, "Iron Wolves, open up! Just want to have a friendly conversation." Mason exchanged a glance with Bear, then moved to a position where he could respond without exposing himself. "We're closed for the night. Come back during business hours." "This isn't about business," Hargrove replied, his tone hardening. "It's about the woman and kid you're harboring. We know they're here, and we're not leaving without them." Bear shifted slightly, positioning himself to cover Mason if necessary. Through their partial view of the front, they could see Hargrove's companion moving to the edge of the garage doors, testing for weaknesses or alternative entry points. "There's a protection order against Derek Wilson," Mason called back. "If he sent you here, you're interfering with a legal court order. I suggest you leave before this becomes a police matter." A harsh laugh answered him. "Police matter? You think the local cops care about a piece of paper? Derek's got friends in places you don't even know about. Now open these doors before we open them for you." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of breaking glass came from somewhere at the rear of the building. The back entrance team was making their move. Mason's radio exploded with Riggs's voice. "They're breaking in through the back office window, 2 men armed." Simultaneously, the front garage doors rattled violently as something heavy struck them, likely a battering ram or makeshift weapon. The coordinated attack had begun. "All positions, defensive measures authorized," Mason ordered into his radio. "Protect the clubhouse. Riggs dock, fall back to the main garage area. We need to consolidate." He turned to Bear. "Get upstairs. Move Carla and Hannah to the safe room. I'll cover you." As Bear sprinted for the stairs, Mason took up a position that gave him clear sight lines to both the front entrance and the passage leading from the back office. The battering at the front doors continued, the metal beginning to buckle under the assault. From the rear came the sounds of struggle, shouts, a crash of furniture, then 3 sharp cracks that Mason instantly recognized as gunfire. His blood ran cold. The situation had escalated to deadly force far faster than he'd anticipated. "Riggs, report," he barked into the radio. The reply came after a tense moment, Doc's voice instead of Riggs's. One intruder down wounded, the other retreated. Riggs took a hit to the shoulder, nothing critical. We're falling back to the main area now. Mason processed this information with the rapid assessment of combat experience. One attacker wounded, another retreated, but now they knew for certain that Derek's crew was armed and willing to use lethal force. The stakes had just risen dramatically. The pounding at the front doors suddenly ceased. Through the gap, Mason could see Hargrove and his companion retreating to a defensive position behind a parked car across the street. They were regrouping, likely communicating with the rear team about the unexpected armed resistance they'd encountered. Mason seized the opportunity to call Officer Reynolds, punching the number into his phone with one hand while keeping his weapon trained on the front entrance. Reynolds, came the immediate answer. It's Mason Cole. We're under attack at the Iron Wolves clubhouse. At least 6 hostiles armed attempting forced entry. Shots fired, 1 wounded so far. We need backup now. Jesus, Reynolds breathed. Hold tight. I'm 3 minutes out calling for all available units. The line went dead as the officer presumably switched to his radio to summon reinforcements. Mason tucked the phone away and raised his radio again. Police on the way. 3 minutes. Everyone hold positions, minimize engagement unless necessary for protection. He switched channels. Bear status. Secure in the safe room, came the reply. Carla and Hannah are okay, scared but handling it. A small relief in an escalating crisis. At least the most vulnerable were protected for now. Riggs and Doc appeared from the back hallway, Riggs clutching his left shoulder where blood seeped through his fingers. Despite the injury, the club president moved with determined focus, his right hand gripping a shotgun. How bad? Mason asked, nodding toward the wound. Through and through, Riggs grunted. Doc's already patched it. I can still fight. Doc looked less certain about that assessment, but didn't contradict his president. Instead, he moved to cover the hallway they'd just emerged from, ensuring no one could follow their retreat. The relative quiet was suddenly shattered by the sound of breaking glass from the apartment above. Mason's heart froze. The windows. They'd secured all the ground floor entry points, but hadn't considered that someone might try to access the second floor directly. Bear, he shouted into his radio. Check the apartment. They might be coming in through the windows. No response came. Either Bear was already engaged with the new threat, or his radio had been damaged or worse. Mason couldn't wait to find out. Cover me, he ordered Riggs and Doc. I'm going upstairs. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Mason sprinted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. The stairwell was exposed, a tactical nightmare, but speed was more important than caution now. At the top, he paused just long enough to assess the situation before entering. The apartment door stood open. Inside, a scene of chaos greeted him. The living room window had been shattered, inward glass shards littering the floor. Bear was engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle with a man Mason didn't recognize, both of them crashing into furniture as they grappled. A second intruder was moving toward the back of the apartment where the safe room was located, a crowbar in his hands. Mason didn't hesitate. He leveled his weapon at the man with the crowbar. Freeze, drop it now. The intruder spun around, eyes widening at the sight of the gun aimed at his chest. For a critical moment, he seemed to calculate his odds, the crowbar still gripped tightly in his hands. Last warning, Mason said, his voice deadly calm. Drop it or I drop you. The man's nerve broke. The crowbar clattered to the floor, and he raised his hand slowly. Don't shoot, man. I'm just the driver. Derek paid me to help, that's all. Mason kept his weapon trained on the surrendering man while assessing Bear's situation from his peripheral vision. His friend had gained the upper hand, driving a knee into his opponent's midsection before delivering a decisive blow to the jaw that sent the man crumpling to the floor unconscious. Bear rose, breathing heavily, a cut above his eye, streaming blood down his face. Came through the window like spiders, he gasped. No warning. Where are Carla and Hannah? Mason demanded, his heart pounding. Still secure, Bear assured him, wiping blood from his eye. Safe room door holds from the inside. They're okay. Relief washed over Mason, quickly replaced by focused determination. He moved to secure the unconscious attacker, using zip ties from his pocket to bind the man's hands behind his back. Bear did the same with the surrendering driver, who offered no resistance, clearly regretting his life choices that had led to this moment. Carla, Hannah, Mason called through the safe room door. It's Mason and Bear. The threat is contained. You're safe. After a moment's hesitation, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back preceded the door opening a crack. Carla peered out, her face pale but composed. Behind her, Hannah clutched her mother's shirt, eyes wide with fear, but dry, a child who had seen too much violence to waste energy on tears. "Are you hurt?" Carla asked immediately, her nurse's instincts taking precedence over her own fear. "Bear's got a cut that needs attention. Otherwise, we're okay. How about you two?" "We're fine," Carla assured him, opening the door fully to step out. She immediately moved to examine Bear's wound with professional efficiency. "This needs cleaning and probably stitches, but it can wait a few minutes." The wail of police sirens approached from outside, multiple vehicles, by the sound of it. Reynolds had come through with the promised backup. "Stay here," Mason instructed. "Keep the door closed but not bolted. I need to go coordinate with the police." Carla nodded, ushering Hannah back into the safe room while she tended to Bear's injury. As Mason turned to leave, Hannah suddenly broke free from her mother's grasp and ran to him, throwing her small arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "I knew you would protect us," she whispered, her face pressed against his leather vest. "I just knew it." The simple faith in her voice struck Mason with unexpected force. He placed a gentle hand on her head, finding no words adequate for the moment. After a brief squeeze, Hannah released him and returned to her mother's side, her expression solemn but steady. Mason descended the stairs to find the main garage area now brightly lit with flashing police lights streaming through the windows. Officer Reynolds was directing several uniformed officers to secure the perimeter, while paramedics attended to Riggs's wound. The front garage doors stood partially open, revealing multiple patrol cars parked haphazardly in the street outside. "Status?" Reynolds asked crisply as Mason approached. "Two intruders subdued upstairs, one unconscious, one surrendered. Both restrained. Bear has a minor injury. Carla and Hannah are safe in the secure room." Reynolds nodded, making notes in a small pad. "We've got 3 in custody out front, including your friend Hargrove. One wounded suspect in the back office being treated by paramedics. Any idea where Derek Wilson is?" The question sent a chill through Mason. In the chaos, he had lost track of the main threat. If Derek wasn't among those captured, he must have stayed back, Mason reasoned aloud, sending his crew in first to test our defenses. "Smart," Reynolds conceded grimly. "And now he knows we're prepared and has lost most of his muscle. Makes him more desperate, more dangerous." Mason couldn't argue with that assessment. Men like Derek, when cornered, often became their most lethal, especially when their freedom was at stake. With his crew captured and facing serious charges, Derek would be looking at significant jail time as an accessory, if not a principal. "We need to find him," Mason said decisively, "before he can regroup or disappear." Reynolds holstered his notebook. "I've already put out an AP. Every patrol car in 3 counties will be looking for him. In the meantime, I want your people to give statements while it's still fresh." He paused, then added more quietly, "You did good here, Mason. Could have been much worse." Mason nodded his acknowledgement, though he took little satisfaction in the praise. The threat wasn't eliminated, only delayed. As long as Derek remained free, Carla and Hannah wouldn't be truly safe. As the police processed the scene and paramedics treated the injured, Mason found himself drawn back upstairs to check on Carla, Hannah, and Bear. He found them in the kitchen, Bear now sporting a professional-looking bandage above his eye, courtesy of Carla's skilled hands. Hannah sat at the table, solemnly coloring in her sketchbook, as if the violent interruption to their evening had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Police want statements from everyone," Mason informed them. "Then they'll likely want to move you to a more secure location until Derek is apprehended." Carla's expression tightened. Another temporary shelter. Another strange place. Mason understood her fatigue. "It would just be for a short time. Once Derek is in custody, you can decide what comes next without looking over your shoulder." Hannah looked up from her drawing. "I don't want to go somewhere else. I like it here with you and Bear and Doc. I feel safe here." The simple declaration hung in the air, carrying more weight than the child could possibly understand. Mason found himself without a ready response, caught between security protocols and the undeniable truth that Hannah had spoken. Despite tonight's attack, the Iron Wolves clubhouse had indeed proven itself a sanctuary. They had repelled the threat, protected their own. Bear broke the silence, his deep voice unusually gentle. "Let's wait and see what the police recommend, kid. Sometimes the smartest thing to do is lay low for a while." Hannah considered this with the solemn deliberation of a child who had learned early that adult decisions often overruled her preferences. "Okay," she said finally, "but can we come back after the bad man is gone for good?" The question was directed at Mason, and he felt its weight settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just about tonight or tomorrow, but about what came after the future that would unfold once the immediate danger had passed. "That would be up to your mom," he replied carefully, "but you'd be welcome here anytime, both of you." Carla's eyes met his across the room, a complex emotion in their green depths that Mason couldn't fully decipher. Gratitude certainly, but also uncertainty, perhaps even fear. Not of Derek now, but of what would follow his removal from their lives, of choices and paths and the unknown territory of a life no longer defined solely by the need to run. The moment was interrupted by Officer Reynolds appearing at the top of the stairs, his expression grave but controlled. "We've got a problem," he announced without preamble. "Derek Wilson just called the station. He says he's willing to turn himself in, but he has conditions. He wants to meet with Carla alone." Carla's breath caught audibly. "That's insane. He doesn't want to surrender. He wants to finish what he started." Reynolds nodded grimly. "That's my assessment too. But he claims to have information about your sister's death evidence that he says will clear him, but implicate others. Says he'll only share it with you face to face." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the room. Mason watched Carla's face, carefully saw the conflict warring within her. The desperate desire to know the truth about her sister's death versus the very real danger that this was simply another of Derek's manipulations. "It's a trap," Bear said flatly. "He's lost his crew and his leverage. This is his last play to get you alone." Reynolds didn't disagree. "We offered him standard surrender terms, public location, police presence. He refused. Wants a private meeting at the old Miller warehouse on the edge of town. Says he'll be gone by morning either way, so it's now or never." Mason felt cold anger building inside him. Even now, cornered and exposed, Derek was still playing games, still trying to maintain control over Carla's life. It was time to end this one way or another. "What if we give him what he's asking for?" Mason said slowly, "but not the way he expects." All eyes turned to him, questioning. "He wants to meet Carla alone, but he doesn't get to dictate all the terms. We set up a controlled meeting. I go with Carla as visible backup police units positioned out of sight but within response range. He thinks he's getting part of what he wants, but we control the situation." Reynolds considered the proposition. "It's risky. He's desperate, which makes him unpredictable." "It's also our best chance to end this tonight," Mason countered. "Otherwise, he disappears and Carla and Hannah spend weeks or months looking over their shoulders waiting for him to make another move." The room fell silent as each person weighed the proposal against the alternatives. Finally, Carla spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "I want to do it," she said. "Not because I believe he has evidence about Melissa. I don't. But because Mason is right, this needs to end tonight, one way or another." She looked at Hannah, who was watching the adults with the wary attention of a child who knew her fate was being decided. "For both our sakes." Reynolds exhaled heavily. "I don't like it, but I see the logic. If we do this, we do it by the book. You wear a wire, we have snipers positioned with sight lines, and you have a clear extraction signal if things go south." Mason nodded in agreement. "And I stay within arm's reach the entire time. Non-negotiable." The plan took shape rapidly after that. Reynolds coordinated with his department to set up a perimeter around the abandoned warehouse, while Doc helped Carla prepare mentally for the confrontation. Bear remained with Hannah, distracting her with motorcycle stories that, under normal circumstances, might have earned him a reprimand from Carla for their mild embellishments. Mason found himself alone for a moment in the kitchen, staring out the window at the night sky. The stars were obscured by cloud cover, the darkness complete, except for the intermittent flash of police lights from the street below. In less than an hour, they would be facing Derek in a final confrontation, risking everything on a calculated gamble. "Are you sure about this?" He turned to find Carla standing in the doorway, watching him with an intensity that suggested she was trying to read more than just his words. "As sure as anyone can be in a situation like this," he answered honestly. "It's a risk, but a controlled one. And it's our best chance to end this tonight." She moved into the kitchen, stopping a few feet away. "Why are you doing all this, Mason? You barely know us. You could have helped that first day and walked away with a clear conscience. Instead, you've put yourself and your friends at risk, turned your home into a fortress? Why? It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself more than once over the past few days. The answer had evolved from simple duty to something more complex, more personal. When I was in the Marines, he began slowly, I had a purpose, a mission. I knew exactly why I was fighting what I was protecting. When I came home and lost my family, that purpose disappeared. I was just existing. He looked directly at her. And then Hannah ran into that diner, and suddenly I had a mission again. Something clear and right and necessary. Carla's eyes softened with understanding. We gave you a purpose. You gave me a reminder, he corrected gently, that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in distant countries, but right here in small towns, in ordinary lives. Sometimes the most meaningful victory is just helping one person feel safe again. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the faint scar above her right eyebrow, a memento from some earlier encounter with Derek's violence. And after tonight, what then? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. What happened when the crisis passed, when the immediate danger was neutralized? What became of connections forged in emergency bonds created under duress? That's up to you, Mason said carefully. You and Hannah will be free to choose your own path. No pressure, no obligations. Carla studied his face for a long moment as if memorizing its contours. And if our path led us back here, not out of necessity, but by choice. Something shifted in Mason's chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't realized was there. Then the door would be open, he said simply. Always. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Reynolds appeared at the top of the stairs, breaking the spell. It's time, he announced. The perimeter is set. Our people are in position. Carla drew a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. I need to say goodbye to Hannah, just in case. Mason watched her walk away, struck by her courage, her determination to face her tormentor one last time to secure her daughter's future. Whatever happened tonight at that warehouse, he made a silent vow that Carla would return to Hannah. Some promises couldn't be spoken aloud, but they bound the soul nonetheless. As he checked his weapon one last time and secured his vest, Mason thought about the drawing Hannah had shown him earlier, the iron wolves standing protectively around her, and her mother, a child's simple depiction of safety found in unexpected guardians. Tonight they would ensure the picture became reality, not just for the immediate crisis, but for all the days to follow. The final confrontation awaited. Derek Wilson had terrorized Carla and Hannah long enough. Tonight he would learn what happened when predators targeted those under the protection of the Iron Wolves. Tonight the hunted would become the hunters, and a new chapter would begin for a mother and daughter who deserved peace at last. Mason descended the stairs to join Reynolds, determination hardening his resolve. Some battles chose you whether you sought them out or not, and some were worth every risk to ensure the right outcome. The just ending that would allow a little girl in a red dress to ride her bicycle without fear, and her mother to sleep without looking over her shoulder. Tonight they would finish what began days ago when Hannah ran into that diner. Tonight they would bring it full circle, from desperate plea to final resolution. Tonight justice would find its way home. The abandoned Miller warehouse loomed against the night sky, its silhouette broken and jagged where sections of roof had collapsed over the years. Moonlight filtered through clouds, casting intermittent silver across the cracked concrete and overgrown parking lot. Mason guided the unmarked police car to a stop 50 yards from the main entrance, headlights cutting through darkness before going dark. You don't have to do this, he said quietly to Carla, who sat beside him in the passenger seat. Her profile was etched in shadow and determination. I do. She touched the wire concealed beneath her shirt. For Hannah, for Melissa, for myself. Mason nodded, respecting her courage. He checked his weapon once more before holstering it. Remember the extraction signal. One word enough, and we're out, no questions asked. I remember, she said, then turned fully toward him. Whatever happens in there, thank you for everything. They exited the car and approached the warehouse on foot, Mason slightly behind Carla, but within arm's reach as promised. Through his earpiece came Officer Reynolds' voice confirming that snipers had visual on the entrance and tactical teams were in position around the perimeter. The old building had only two viable entrances, both covered. The heavy metal door groaned as Carla pulled it open. Inside, darkness gave way to weak illumination from a single work light in the center of the cavernous space. Derek stood beside it, his face half in shadow. He was alone as far as Mason could see, though his eyes scanned the rafters and darker corners instinctively. I said, come alone. Derek spat when he saw Mason, his hand moving toward his waistband. Where I go, he goes, Carla replied with steady conviction. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. Derek's eyes narrowed, assessing, calculating. Finally, he shrugged. Doesn't matter. He can hear this too. There was something off about his demeanor, a manic energy underlying his forced casualness. His eyes darted around too much, his movements jerky and unpredictable. You said you had information about Melissa, Carla prompted, taking a careful step forward. Evidence. Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal rafters. Always so direct, Carla. That's what I liked about you. His expression darkened. Until you started asking too many questions. Like how my sister really died. Carla's voice remained level, though Mason could see the tension in her shoulders. Melissa was weak, Derek said dismissively. Always crying, always questioning. Sound familiar? His gaze flicked to Mason, then back to Carla. She found out some things about my business arrangements. Couldn't keep her mouth shut. So you killed her. Carla stated not a question, but a confirmation of what she'd always suspected. Derek's expression shifted, something like pride crossing his features. Made it look like an overdose. Perfect, really. Even had the medical examiner fooled. He paced in a small circle, that manic energy becoming more pronounced. Would have worked with you too eventually. But then you took Hannah and ran. Mason tensed, recognizing the dangerous unpredictability of a cornered man. Through his earpiece, Reynolds confirmed that they were getting every word, that the confession was being recorded. You said you had evidence, Carla pressed, her voice stronger now, about others being involved. Derek laughed again. That was just to get you here. He stopped pacing, fixing Carla with a cold stare. Did you really think I'd just surrender? Give myself up after everything? No. This ends tonight, but not the way your biker boyfriend thinks. His hand moved with unexpected speed, producing a gun from his waistband. But Mason was faster, years of combat training taking over. He lunged forward, grabbing Derek's wrist and forcing it upward as the gun discharged into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the confined space, raining dust and debris down upon them. They struggled, Mason using his superior strength and training to keep the weapon pointed away from Carla, who had moved back toward the entrance. Derek fought with the desperate fury of a man with nothing to lose, landing a solid blow to Mason's ribs that momentarily loosened his grip. The gun swung wildly between them, Derek's fingers still on the trigger. Another shot rang out, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding in the dim light. Mason felt a burning sensation along his upper arm, but maintained his grip on Derek's wrist, twisting until the bone reached its breaking point. With a howl of pain, Derek finally released the weapon. It clattered to the concrete floor as Mason delivered a precision strike to Derek's solar plexus, dropping him to his knees. In seconds, he had Derek face down on the ground, knee and his back wrist secured behind him. The warehouse doors burst open as tactical officers flooded in, weapons drawn. Reynolds was among them, quickly moving to secure the scene. We got it all, he confirmed, holstering his sidearm as other officers took custody of Derek. Full confession recorded. He won't be getting out this time. Mason rose shakily to his feet, suddenly aware of the warm wetness spreading down his arm. The bullet had grazed him, taking a chunk of flesh, but missing bone and major vessels. Already a paramedic was approaching to assess the wound, but his eyes sought only Carla, finding her standing with Reynolds, pale but composed. When their gazes met across the warehouse floor, something passed between them. Understanding, relief, perhaps something more. It was over. Finally over. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, still hurling threats and obscenities, Mason watched him go with a curious sense of detachment. Men like Derek had always existed, would always exist, predators who confused cruelty for strength, control for power. But tonight, and such man had been stopped. One family freed from his shadow. It was enough. 6 months later, the Iron Wolves clubhouse was transformed by summer sunlight streaming through freshly cleaned windows. The garage doors stood wide open to catch the breeze as motorcycles lined the front chrome, gleaming in the midday sun. The sound of laughter, a child's high, clear voice mingled with deeper adult tones, spilled out into the street. Inside the garage had been temporarily converted for a celebration. A banner reading "Congratulations, Carla" hung from the rafters, slightly crooked, but made with obvious care. Tables laden with food and drinks formed a buffet along one wall, while members of the Iron Wolves mingled with townspeople who months ago might have crossed the street to avoid them. Mason stood by the workbench, nursing a beer and watching as Hannah proudly showed Officer Reynolds her new bicycle, the same one she and Mason had repaired together, now painted a gleaming red to match her favorite dress. The officer listened with exaggerated interest as she explained each component, occasionally glancing up to share an amused look with Mason. "Quite the apprentice you've got there," Bear rumbled, appearing at Mason's side. "Kid knows more about bikes than half the prospects we get these days." Mason smiled, his eyes tracking Hannah as she moved through the crowd. "She's a quick study, smart as they come." "Like her mother," Bear observed, nodding toward the center of the room where Carla stood in conversation with Doc and several nurses from the hospital, where she now worked full-time. Her copper hair was caught up in a neat ponytail, her green eyes animated as she described something with expressive hand gestures. The faded bruises were long gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that made her seem taller, somehow more present. The party was celebrating her official certification as an emergency room nurse, a goal she'd pursued relentlessly since settling permanently in town. The hospital had been so impressed with her skills that they'd sponsored her additional training, fast-tracking her back into the profession she'd abandoned during her years on the run. "You ever think about how different things might have turned out?" Bear asked quietly. "If Hannah hadn't run into that diner that morning?" Mason considered the question seriously. "Every day," he admitted. "But then I stopped thinking about what might have been and focus on what is." What was this Derek Wilson serving 20 years to life for the murder of Melissa, with additional charges for assault, attempted murder, and drug trafficking. The evidence from his phone and the testimonies of his captured associates had been enough to dismantle the small drug operation he had been part of. What was Carla and Hannah in a small house 3 blocks from the clubhouse, close enough that Hannah could ride her bicycle to visit after school, far enough that Carla maintained her independence. Their relationship had evolved slowly, deliberately, both of them carrying enough scars to know that healing takes time and patience. What was Mason Cole no longer simply existing but living again, finding purpose not just in moments of crisis, but in quiet Tuesday evenings helping Hannah with her science project, or Sunday mornings riding alongside Carla as she gained confidence on the Harley he was teaching her to handle. "You going to ask her?" Bear nodded toward the silver ring box partially concealed in Mason's jacket pocket. His friend had always been too observant for his own good. Eventually, Mason replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "When the time is right. No rush." The festivities continued around them, the unlikely family they'd formed expanding to include the town that had once viewed them with suspicion. Iron Wolves members chatted with local business owners, old barriers falling away in the wake of shared purpose and mutual respect. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Hannah appeared at Mason's side, tugging at his hand. "Come see what I made," she insisted, pulling him toward a table covered with her artwork. Among the colorful drawings was a framed picture more detailed than her earlier works. It showed the Iron Wolves gathered around their motorcycles with Mason, Carla, and Hannah at the center. Above them, she had written in careful letters, "My family." Mason felt something tighten in his chest as he looked at the simple declaration. "It's perfect," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Hannah beamed up at him, no trace remaining of the frightened child who had burst into the diner that fateful morning. "I knew you'd like it. Mama said we could hang it in the clubhouse if that's okay with you." "More than okay," Mason assured her, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "This is exactly where it belongs." Across the room, Carla caught his eye and smiled, a private expression meant only for him. In it, Mason saw not just the present moment, but the future stretching out before them. Not perfect, not without challenges, but theirs to shape together. Sometimes the most unexpected journeys led to exactly where you were meant to be. Sometimes brave hearts found each other against all odds and created something stronger than either could have built alone. And sometimes a little girl in a red dress running into a diner could change everything, setting in motion a chain of events that would heal wounds long thought beyond repair. Mason Cole looked around at the family he'd found biological and chosen, forged in crisis but built to last. and knew with absolute certainty that he was home.